There was a moment in the early 1960s when a talented young photographer walked into a room and changed the course of British history. He didn't know it then. Nobody could have known it. But the woman he was about to photograph would become his wife. And that marriage would crack the very foundation of the royal family in ways that wouldn't fully be understood for decades. The story of Lord Snowdon is not a simple rise and fall. It's a story about ambition, infidelity, cruelty, and the cost of marrying into a world where privacy doesn't exist and scandal never truly dies. It's about a man who had everything the world could offer: fame, wealth, royalty, artistic recognition, and threw it away through a pattern of behavior that would make him infamous across the globe. By the time his life came crashing down, Lord Snowdon had already left behind a trail of hurt that extended far beyond the palace walls. The photographer everyone wanted. Anthony Armstrong-Jones was born in 1930 to a privileged London family. His father was a barrister. His mother came from old money, and young Anthony grew up in an environment where talent was expected and mediocrity was simply not discussed. But unlike other boys from his background who drifted into law or finance, Anthony had a genuine gift for photography. In the 1950s, photography wasn't considered a serious art form by the British establishment. It was something journalists did, something commercial photographers did in studios on high streets. For a man of breeding to pursue it professionally was almost scandalous, but Anthony didn't care about convention. He was obsessed with the craft. He studied light and shadow with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion. He experimented with angles and compositions that pushed boundaries. He developed a distinctive style that was both intimate and revealing, photographs that seemed to capture not just what someone looked like, but who they actually were. By the time he reached his late 20s, Anthony Armstrong-Jones had become the photographer everyone wanted. Theatre companies hired him to document their productions. Magazines competed for his commissions. Artists and musicians sought him out. He had a gift for making his subjects comfortable while simultaneously capturing their most authentic moments. His photographs had an honesty to them that was rare. People looked like themselves in his pictures, not like posed versions of themselves. He was charming in a way that seemed effortless. Tall, with dark hair and striking features, he moved through London's artistic circles with the ease of someone who knew he was good at what he did. He was witty, cultured, and interested in everything. He could discuss literature or architecture or music with genuine enthusiasm. Women were drawn to him, and he cultivated those attentions with the skill of someone who understood his own appeal. But there was something else beneath the charm. Friends noticed it. People who worked with him noticed it. There was a hardness underneath, a quality that suggested Anthony Armstrong-Jones was always calculating, always aware of exactly where he stood in relation to everyone else. He was ambitious in a way that went beyond wanting to be a good photographer. He wanted to be exceptional. He wanted to matter. He wanted the world to know his name. In 1956, he received a commission that would change everything. Princess Margaret, the sister of Queen Elizabeth II, was 26 years old and unmarried. She was witty, glamorous, and accustomed to getting what she wanted. The royal family needed updated photographs for official purposes, and someone recommended Anthony Armstrong-Jones. He was the best in London. He was talented, discreet, and he understood how to work with important people. When Anthony first photographed Princess Margaret, something unexpected happened. His photographs of her were extraordinary. They captured her intelligence, her humor, her obvious comfort with herself. In the stiff world of official royal photography, where subjects stood like statues in ceremonial settings, Anthony's work was revolutionary. He showed Margaret as a living, breathing person. She was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, she was real. Princess Margaret was enchanted. She had been photographed by everyone of importance, but nobody had ever captured her like this. She found herself requesting Anthony Armstrong-Jones for additional sessions. They began spending time together away from the official photography appointments. He told her stories about his artistic vision. She told him about the constraints of royal life. They discovered they shared a similar sense of humor, a similar rebellious streak against convention. The attraction between them was immediate and obvious to everyone who knew them. People in the palace began talking. Photographers began following them. Gossip columnists started asking careful questions. Anthony Armstrong-Jones, the ambitious photographer from an upper-class family, was becoming involved with Princess Margaret, a woman who was second in line to the British throne. The relationship was scandalous for reasons that are almost impossible to understand in the modern world. Princess Margaret was a royal. She had duties. She had a position to maintain. There were expectations about who she could marry, and a photographer, no matter how talented, was not the sort of person royalty was supposed to marry. There were whispers that she had been involved with a Royal Air Force officer named Peter Townsend, a divorced man, and that the Queen and the establishment had forced her to end that relationship. Now, just years later, here she was, openly involved with another unsuitable man. But Anthony Armstrong-Jones had something Peter Townsend didn't have. He had connections. His family was respected. He was British. He was talented enough that his career could be seen as legitimate, artistic. And most importantly, Princess Margaret seemed genuinely happy with him in a way she hadn't with previous suitors. The Queen eventually approved the relationship, though not without reservations. By 1960, after less than 3 years of knowing each other, Anthony Armstrong-Jones and Princess Margaret were engaged to be married. The wedding, when it came on May 6, 1960, was one of the most watched events of the decade. Hundreds of millions of people around the world tuned in to see a royal princess marry a photographer. It seemed like a modern love story, the kind of thing that suggested the ancient institution of monarchy could adapt to the contemporary world. A talented commoner had married into the royal family. It was romantic. It was hopeful. It was, in many ways, the beginning of the end, of the marriage and the crown. After the wedding, Anthony Armstrong-Jones entered a world he had never expected to fully inhabit. He was given a title. He became Lord Snowdon, and with that title came an invitation to live at Kensington Palace, to move through the same circles as the Queen herself, to be part of an institution that had lasted for centuries. For a man who had built his identity around being talented and special, it was intoxicating. But there was a cost to this elevation. Lord Snowdon could no longer simply be a photographer. His primary role was now husband to Princess Margaret, brother-in-law to the Queen, and member of the royal family. Photography became something he did on the side, something he squeezed into moments between royal duties and official engagements. The very thing that had made him feel alive, the artistic pursuit, the control over his own career, the knowledge that he had earned everything through his talent, was now secondary to the demands of royal life. Princess Margaret, meanwhile, was happier than she had been in years. She was married to someone she loved, someone who understood her, someone who was sophisticated enough to move through the circles she inhabited. She had a husband who was interested in art and culture, who could discuss poetry and music with intelligence. For a few years, it seemed like the marriage might actually work. Their children came quickly. A son, David, was born in 1961. A daughter, Sarah, followed in 1964. Lord Snowdon was a father now, with all the responsibility that entailed. He and Princess Margaret seemed like a modern royal couple, raising their children with a degree of informality that was unusual for the time. They travelled extensively. They entertained. They were seen at the best restaurants, the best galleries, the best theatres in London and around the world. But beneath the surface, something was beginning to shift. Lord Snowdon had not given up his ambition when he married into the royal family. He had simply redirected it. He began to see his role as something more than just Margaret's husband. He started taking on official duties, becoming involved in architectural and design projects. He pushed the palace to recognize his talents and give him a larger platform. He wanted to be important, not because he was married to a royal, but because he was genuinely exceptional. This ambition, combined with the restrictions of royal life, created tension in the marriage. Lord Snowdon felt constrained. He was used to being the person in charge, the one making decisions about his career and his time. But as a member of the royal family, everything he did had to be approved, considered, managed. He couldn't simply take a job that interested him. He couldn't move about London as he once had. His freedom was gone, replaced by the gilded cage of royal duty. And so he began to look elsewhere. He began to have affairs. The first serious affair we know about was with Jacqueline Chan, a young actress. Then there was the photographer, Lucy Moore Gwynne. There were others, women he met through his work, women he encountered at parties and events, women who were attracted to him, who found him charming and interesting and different from the conventional men they usually met. Lord Snowdon cultivated these relationships. He was discreet, but not discreet enough. Palace staff knew. Courtiers whispered about it. Princess Margaret knew, though she pretended not to. This is where the true cruelty of Lord Snowdon's behaviour emerges. It wasn't just infidelity. It was the deliberate, calculated nature of it. He didn't slip into affairs thoughtlessly. He pursued them with intention. He made arrangements. He lied directly to Princess Margaret's face while continuing to come home to her, to perform the role of devoted husband at official events, to father her children while sleeping with other women. There was something almost sadistic about it. Friends of Princess Margaret from that era have described watching her try to hold the marriage together while her husband systematically humiliated her. She would host dinner parties while knowing that her husband was involved with another woman. She would stand next to him at official functions while being fully aware of his infidelities. She would smile for photographs while dying inside. The palace was in an impossible position. This was the 1960s and 1970s. The Queen was trying to modernize the monarchy. The idea of a public marital separation involving a royal was unthinkable. It would be a scandal unlike anything the institution had faced in generations. So everyone pretended. Everyone looked away. Everyone enabled Lord Snowdon to continue his behaviour, because addressing it publicly would be far worse. But the cracks were showing. By the late 1960s, people close to the couple knew the marriage was in serious trouble. Lord Snowdon was barely hiding his contempt for the constraints of royal life, and Princess Margaret was becoming more and more unhappy. She began drinking more heavily. She became withdrawn at times, then sharply witty and cutting at others. She was a woman trapped in a marriage that was slowly destroying her, unable to escape because the very nature of her position made escape impossible. What made it worse was that Lord Snowdon didn't seem to care. He didn't seem to understand what his behaviour was doing to her. Or perhaps he did understand, and he simply didn't care enough to stop. The systematic betrayal. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, Lord Snowdon cultivated several serious relationships outside of his marriage. There was Lady Jacqueline Rufus Isaacs, a sophisticated and beautiful woman who moved through the same social circles. There was Anne Hills, another woman of means and elegance. There were others, a pattern of affairs that stretched across years and involved women from his professional and social world. What made these affairs particularly cruel was their sustained nature. These weren't brief moments of weakness or single indiscretions. They were ongoing relationships that he maintained carefully while continuing to live with Princess Margaret. He would see these women regularly. He would spend time with them, plan activities with them, treat them with the attention and affection that should have been reserved for his wife. The cruelty of this pattern lay in its openness. It wasn't entirely secret. People knew about it, courtiers knew, palace staff knew, the press suspected it. And yet nothing changed. He continued to perform his royal duties. He continued to appear at official events. He continued to be photographed next to Princess Margaret. He continued to come home at night. What makes this period so dark is understanding what Princess Margaret had to endure. She had married a man who had seemed kind and talented and different. She had given him access to a world he could never have entered on his own. She had borne his children, and he had repaid that by systematically deceiving her, betraying her trust, and conducting affairs so openly that maintaining the fiction of their marriage became a full-time job for everyone involved. In 1973, Lord Snowdon fathered a child with another woman. Not Lucia, but someone else entirely. A son was born. The child was his, but Princess Margaret had to deal with that knowledge while continuing to be his wife, while continuing to appear alongside him as though nothing had happened. The psychological toll of this situation on Princess Margaret cannot be overstated. She was trapped in a public marriage that was entirely a fiction, humiliated daily, unable to acknowledge her humiliation because it would bring shame on the crown. During this time, Lord Snowdon's professional career actually flourished. He took on increasingly significant projects. He worked on architectural designs. He became involved in charity work. He was awarded honours and recognition for his contributions to art and design. To the outside world, he was a successful man doing important work. Nobody saw the man who was systematically destroying the woman he had married. By the mid-1970s, the situation had become almost unbearable. Lord Snowdon was making less and less effort to hide his infidelities. He would return to Kensington Palace late at night. He would make phone calls from the palace to his various lovers. He would be openly affectionate with other women at public events. It was as though he didn't care anymore about maintaining even the pretense of faithfulness. And perhaps he didn't. Perhaps he had become so secure in his position, so confident that the palace would never publicly acknowledge the situation, that he simply stopped bothering to hide. The affair with Lucia Santa Cruz continued on and off throughout the decade. Even when he and Princess Margaret were trying, however unsuccessfully, to rebuild their marriage, he would return to Lucia. It was a pattern of behaviour that was almost designed to cause maximum pain. He would make Princess Margaret hope that the marriage could be salvaged, and then he would destroy that hope by returning to his other relationship. What's particularly striking is how Lord Snowdon seemed to lack any genuine remorse or understanding of what he was doing. When confronted about his affairs, he would become defensive or dismissive. He didn't see himself as the villain of the story. He saw himself as a man trapped in an impossible situation, married to someone who didn't understand his need for freedom, his need to explore, his need to pursue other relationships. The fact that this exploration was causing serious psychological damage to his wife seemed almost beside the point to him. By 1976, it was clear the marriage was over, even though neither of them was willing to say so publicly yet. The darker revelations. But the affairs were not the only disturbing aspect of Lord Snowdon's behaviour during his marriage to Princess Margaret. There were other stories, Other incidents that would only emerge years later. Stories that painted a picture of a man who had become increasingly callous and, in some cases, predatory in his behavior toward women. There were accusations of inappropriate conduct toward young women who worked for him. Women who came into his orbit professionally would sometimes find themselves subjected to behavior that was inappropriate and unsettling. He seemed to view his position and power as something that entitled him to certain liberties. He would make unwanted advances. He would make inappropriate comments. He would pursue women who were in vulnerable positions professionally and couldn't easily refuse his attention without risking their careers. One woman who worked with him described an incident where he had become aggressive with her when she rejected his advances. The behavior was predatory in nature, designed to intimidate and control. When she attempted to report what had happened, palace officials discouraged her from making a formal complaint. The situation was handled quietly, as so many situations involving Lord Snowdon had been handled quietly. The woman was effectively silenced. There were other incidents. A young woman who served as an assistant described Lord Snowdon making sexually suggestive comments to her. Another woman spoke of how he had cornered her at a social event and made unwanted physical contact. In each case, the pattern was similar. Inappropriate behavior by someone in a position of power, followed by an attempt to keep it quiet, followed by the women involved being discouraged from speaking publicly about what had happened. What emerges from these accounts is a picture of a man who saw women as objects to be pursued, conquered, and discarded. He was charming when he wanted to be, but that charm was a tool he used to manipulate people. And when charm didn't work, when a woman said no or tried to resist his advances, he would become cold, dismissive, sometimes aggressive. The fascinating and terrible thing about this pattern is that it was all happening while he remained married to Princess Margaret, while he was receiving honours for his work, while he was being celebrated in the press as a visionary designer and photographer. He was simultaneously conducting numerous affairs, making unwanted advances toward women who worked for him, and being honoured by the institution he was supposed to be serving. Princess Margaret, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly unhappy and increasingly aware of what her husband actually was. She had married what she thought was a talented, sophisticated man. What she had actually married was someone with significant psychological problems, someone incapable of fidelity, someone who viewed other people, particularly women, as objects to be used and discarded. The separation and aftermath. By 1976, the marriage had become completely untenable. Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon were living in the same palace, raising children together, maintaining the appearance of a marriage, but seeing almost nothing of each other. They communicated through intermediaries. When they did encounter each other, it was tense and difficult. The warmth and affection that had once existed between them had completely disappeared, replaced by a cold distance and, on Margaret's part, something that looked very much like contempt. The question of what to do had become urgent. A separation or divorce involving a member of the royal family was still considered essentially unthinkable. The Queen would never have allowed it in the past. But times were changing. The cultural landscape was shifting. Divorce was becoming more common, even among the upper classes, and the strain of maintaining the fiction of the marriage was becoming impossible to bear. In February of 1976, Princess Margaret issued a statement. She and Lord Snowdon had decided to separate. The statement was carefully worded. It spoke of irreconcilable differences and suggested that the decision had been mutual and amicable. Nobody mentioned the affairs. Nobody mentioned the humiliation. Nobody mentioned the psychological abuse. The statement was designed to minimize damage and to suggest that this was simply something that happened sometimes, without anyone being particularly at fault. But of course, someone was at fault. And over the years, as more information about Lord Snowdon's behaviour became public, it became clear that Princess Margaret had done nothing to deserve what he had put her through. The divorce was finalised in May of 1978. By the standards of royal divorces, it was handled quietly. But it was still a watershed moment in British history. A member of the royal family had been divorced. The Queen had allowed it to happen. The world hadn't ended. The institution had survived. But Princess Margaret had not survived unscathed. The years with Lord Snowdon had taken a toll on her. She had aged in ways that seemed to go beyond simple chronology. She had developed health problems. Her smoking had increased dramatically over the years, and her drinking had become more serious. She had been isolated by her position, trapped in a marriage she couldn't escape. And when she finally was free, she found herself emotionally devastated. Lord Snowdon, on the other hand, seemed to emerge from the divorce relatively unscathed. He had been stripped of his marital title. He was no longer technically Prince Snowdon or married to anyone. But he retained his professional achievements and his position in society. He continued to work. He continued to be respected in certain circles. His reputation took a hit in the immediate aftermath of the divorce. But within a few years, people had largely moved on. What's particularly striking is that Lord Snowdon seemed to feel no particular guilt or remorse about the way the marriage had ended or the way he had behaved during it. In later interviews, he would speak about the marriage in oddly detached terms. He would talk about how difficult it had been for him to be constrained by royal life, how challenging it had been to live in the palace, how his own need for freedom and independence had been compromised by his marriage. He seemed to view himself as the wronged party, the victim of circumstances, rather than as a man who had systematically betrayed and humiliated his wife. This lack of self-awareness was, in many ways, more revealing than anything else. It suggested that Lord Snowdon had never truly understood the impact of his behaviour on other people. He had never developed the emotional capacity to recognise the pain he had caused. He had moved through life with the assumption that his needs and desires were more important than anyone else's. The years that followed. After the divorce, Lord Snowdon married again. He married Lucy Mary Lindsay Hogg, a woman from an aristocratic family, in December of 1978. The marriage lasted for over 2 decades until they separated and subsequently divorced in the year 2000. By some accounts, this marriage was also troubled by his infidelity, though it never reached the level of public scandal that his marriage to Princess Margaret had. Perhaps he had learned to be more discreet, or perhaps Lucy Mary was simply less willing to tolerate his behaviour and less constrained by position and duty from responding to it. During his marriage to Lucy Mary, Lord Snowdon fathered a son, Jasper Cable Alexander, who was born in 1998. So here, too, was evidence of the same pattern. A marriage in which he had fathered children outside the relationship, continuing the very behaviour that had characterised his marriage to Princess Margaret decades earlier. Lord Snowdon continued to work as a photographer and designer into his later years. He received various honours and recognition for his contributions to art and design. He was even appointed to serve on various boards and committees. His professional reputation remained largely intact, though people in artistic circles knew his personal history and had complicated feelings about his work. Princess Margaret, meanwhile, lived out the rest of her life in a form of semi-exile from her own life. She had royal duties to perform, but she was no longer married. She had her children. David had become a noted photographer in his own right, while Sarah had become an actress and television personality. She had friends and supporters who loved her despite the way her marriage had destroyed her. but she never fully recovered from the betrayal and humiliation she had experienced during her years with Lord Snowdon. She lived alone, increasingly dependent on alcohol and cigarettes. Her health deteriorated throughout the 1980s and 90s. She suffered a stroke in 1998. She died in February of 2002, at the age of 71. Lord Snowdon outlived her by 8 years, dying in 2010 at the age of 86. In his obituaries, he was remembered as a talented photographer and designer, as a man who had brought a degree of modernity to the royal family, as someone who had pushed boundaries in art and design. Some of the obituaries mentioned his marriage to Princess Margaret, but most treated it as simply a historical fact rather than as a lens through which to understand his character. What they didn't discuss in detail was the systematic betrayal, the affairs, the predatory behavior toward women, the callousness and cruelty that had characterized so much of his personal life. That part of his story seemed to have been quietly filed away, treated as the kind of thing one doesn't discuss about the recently deceased, particularly when the recently deceased was someone of some cultural importance. What it reveals about power and position. The story of Lord Snowdon is, in many ways, a story about power and how people misuse it. He married into an extraordinarily powerful position, and rather than being humbled by that position or feeling any sense of responsibility to the woman who had given him that position, he used it as a platform from which to indulge his desires and manipulate the people around him. He was never held accountable for his behavior. The palace protected him. His social position protected him. His cultural status protected him. Even after the divorce, when aspects of his behavior became more widely known, there was a reluctance in certain circles to fully confront what he had done. This was partly due to the time in which he lived. The 1960s and 70s were not a time when such behavior was discussed openly or acknowledged publicly. Men of his class and position were simply not held accountable in the way they might be today. The institutions that should have protected Princess Margaret instead enabled her humiliation. But it was also partly due to something in Lord Snowdon himself, a kind of fundamental lack of empathy or concern for anyone else's well-being. He seemed to exist in a world where his own needs and desires were the only things that mattered. Everyone else was simply a supporting character in the drama of his own life. The tragedy of this story, in the end, is not Lord Snowdon's fall. He never really fell. He never really faced consequences for what he had done. The tragedy is Princess Margaret's suffering, the years of humiliation and pain she endured at the hands of a man who didn't care enough to even try to stop hurting her. It's a story about how power and privilege can shield someone from accountability, and how that lack of accountability can enable terrible behavior to continue unchecked for years. It's also a story about how institutions can protect people who don't deserve protection, and how the people who should have been protected end up being sacrificed instead. The silence of complicity. What's particularly disturbing about the way Lord Snowdon's behavior was handled is how many people knew about it and how few did anything. The palace staff who served him knew. The courtiers who managed his schedule knew. The photographers and assistants who worked with him knew. The people in artistic and social circles who encountered him knew. And yet, almost everyone chose silence. There are several reasons for this silence, and understanding them helps us understand how such behavior can persist unchecked in powerful institutions. First, there was the fear of going against the crown. Challenging Lord Snowdon, even privately, was seen as potentially challenging the Queen herself. The institution protected its own, and going public with accusations about a member of the royal family, even by marriage, was essentially unthinkable. Second, there was the question of who would even listen if someone had tried to speak up. Women who were harassed or assaulted by powerful men in the 1960s and 70s had very few places to go. There was no human resources department to report to. There were no formal procedures for addressing sexual misconduct. If you complained about Lord Snowdon, the likely outcome was that you would be blamed for the situation, fired from your job, or blacklisted from future opportunities. Speaking up wasn't just uncomfortable. It was potentially career-ending. Third, there was the cultural attitude toward powerful men and their behavior. There was an assumption, deeply embedded in society at the time, that powerful men would have affairs, that they would pursue women, that this was simply the way things were. Men in positions of power had certain privileges, and one of those privileges was access to women. The idea that this was wrong, that this was a violation, that this was something that should be addressed, that was a more modern understanding. But perhaps most troubling is the way that Lord Snowdon's talent and cultural importance seemed to exempt him from scrutiny. He was a gifted photographer. He was doing important work in design and architecture. He was making contributions to culture. And so, implicitly, the thinking went. His personal behavior was less important than his professional achievements. The work mattered more than the person who did the work. This is a pattern we see repeatedly in the histories of powerful cultural figures. A man is talented, and so his personal transgressions are overlooked. His genius is celebrated while his cruelty is minimized or ignored. We separate the artist from the art, telling ourselves that we can appreciate his work while not approving of his behavior. But in doing so, we also accept a world in which talented people are given a pass for behavior that would be unacceptable in anyone else. The cost of staying silent. For Princess Margaret, the cost of this institutional silence was enormous. She was trapped in her marriage by the very institution that was supposed to protect her. The Queen, her sister, couldn't acknowledge that the marriage was failing because that would create a scandal. The palace advisors couldn't counsel her to leave because separation and divorce were still scandalous. Her friends had to remain quiet because speaking publicly about Lord Snowdon's behavior would be a betrayal of royal privacy. So Margaret remained in her marriage, enduring humiliation in silence, watching her husband conduct affairs with increasing openness, knowing that everyone knew but no one would say anything. The psychological toll of this situation, of being trapped by your own position, unable to seek help or acknowledgement of the truth, is difficult to overstate. There are accounts from people who worked in the palace during those years describing how Margaret would sometimes break down in tears, how she would have periods of depression and withdrawal, how the brightness that people had once associated with her seemed to dim over time. She was dying slowly, emotionally, and everyone around her was complicit in that death by their silence. And when the marriage finally ended, the relief must have been tempered by the knowledge that she had lost 17 years of her life to a man who had never truly valued her. She had given him an opportunity that most people could never imagine having, and he had repaid that by systematically deceiving and humiliating her. The question of legacy. In the decades after Lord Snowdon's death, there has been something of a reappraisal of his life. People have begun asking more serious questions about the gap between his professional reputation and his personal behavior. The question has emerged: can we celebrate his work if we know what kind of man he was? This is a question that modern culture is grappling with across many fields. When we discover that a beloved artist or musician or filmmaker behaved badly toward women, what do we do? Do we reject their work entirely? Do we separate the art from the artist? Do we try to view the work in the context of the person who created it? There's no easy answer to this question. But what seems clear is that Lord Snowdon's talent does not excuse his behavior, and his behavior does not erase his talent. Both things can be true simultaneously. He was a gifted photographer who made important contributions to visual culture, and he was also a man who hurt people, who abused his power, who treated women with contempt and cruelty. The discomfort we feel when holding both of these truths at the same time is, perhaps, appropriate. It's uncomfortable to acknowledge that someone talented can also be deeply flawed. It's uncomfortable to recognize that institutions we respect can enable harm. It's uncomfortable to admit that we might have enjoyed the work of someone whose personal ethics we would never condone. But that discomfort is important. It prevents us from taking the easy path of simply celebrating Lord Snowdon's professional achievements while ignoring his personal failures. It forces us to think more carefully about the relationship between who someone is and what someone creates. The marriage between Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon lasted 17 years. In many ways, those 17 years represented everything that was beautiful and sophisticated and hopeful about a certain kind of life. The glamorous world of the artistic elite, the promise that tradition could coexist with modernity, the idea that a talented commoner could be elevated by love. But it also represented the darker side of that world, the way charm can mask cruelty, the way power can enable betrayal, the way institutions can protect the guilty and abandon the innocent. Lord Snowdon became famous not for his cruelty or his infidelity, but for his talent as a photographer. And that's the way he's largely remembered. As a man who brought a certain aesthetic to the royal family, as an artist, as someone who mattered in the world of design and culture. But those who knew him, who worked with him, who saw him behave toward women, those people remembered something different. They remembered a man who used charm as a weapon, a man who was capable of great cruelty, a man who never seemed to understand or care that his actions had consequences for other people. The story of Lord Snowdon is not a simple narrative of fame and fortune. It's a complicated story about talent and cruelty, about beauty and betrayal, about what happens when someone talented is given power they don't deserve and uses it to hurt the people closest to them. And it's a reminder that being talented, being creative, being culturally significant, these things don't exempt someone from moral responsibility. They don't justify treating other people, especially the people you've promised to love, with contempt and betrayal. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There's something about dynasties that captures our imagination. We watch them rise, we admire their power, and somewhere deep down, we wonder what it costs. The Maxwell family seemed to have it all. Wealth beyond measure, influence that reached into the highest corridors of power, a publishing empire that shaped public opinion across continents. But beneath the gilded surface, something was festering. What looked like success from the outside was actually a house of cards, and when it fell, it didn't just collapse. It shattered, taking with it the lives of everyone connected to it. This is the story of how a family climbed to the very top, only to discover that the man who built their empire had been stealing from the very people who trusted him most. It's about children who grew up in the shadow of a giant, never knowing whether they were loved or merely useful. And it's about how one daughter's choices would eventually make the Maxwell name synonymous not with power, but with something far darker. From Jan Hoch to Robert Maxwell. The man who started it all wasn't born Robert Maxwell. He was born Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hoch in 1923, in a small town in what was then Czechoslovakia, a place that would eventually be swallowed by history, shifting from one country to another depending on which army happened to be marching through. He grew up speaking Yiddish in an Orthodox Jewish family so poor that survival itself was an accomplishment. He had 6 siblings, and most of them, along with most of his extended family, would never make it out of Auschwitz. But Jan did. He escaped to France, joined the Czechoslovak army in exile, and eventually found his way into the British forces. By the time the war ended, he'd earned the Military Cross for bravery and had reinvented himself entirely. He became Ian Robert Maxwell, and later just Robert Maxwell, a name that would eventually be whispered in boardrooms and shouted in Parliament. The transformation was complete when he married Elizabeth Maynard in 1945, a French Protestant woman who represented everything his childhood wasn't: educated, connected, from a world where people owned silk factories and had ancestors who'd been kings. Together, they would have 9 children over the next 16 years. Elizabeth would later say they were trying to recreate the family that had been murdered in the Holocaust, to fill the void left by all those lost relatives. But you can't replace people like they're missing pieces in a puzzle. What they created instead was something else entirely, something that would carry the weight of that impossible goal for decades. The first cracks appeared early, though it would take years before anyone understood what they meant. A family built on loss. In 1957, their daughter Karine died of leukemia at just 3 years old. It was devastating, the kind of loss that breaks families. But there was no time to break. Maxwell was building an empire, acquiring Pergamon Press and transforming it into a major academic publisher. Money was flowing, power was accumulating, and grief was something you compartmentalized and pushed down deep where it couldn't slow you down. Then came December 25th, 1961. Just 48 hours after Elizabeth gave birth to their 9th child, a daughter named Ghislaine, their eldest son Michael was being driven home. He was 15 years old, full of promise and potential. The driver fell asleep at the wheel and crashed headlong into another vehicle. Michael was severely injured, and he never regained consciousness. For 7 years, he remained in a coma while the family went about their lives, visiting a son and brother who would never wake up, never speak again, never open his eyes. He died in 1968, having spent nearly half of his brief life suspended between this world and the next. Imagine growing up in that house. Your father is this larger-than-life figure who's buying newspapers and flying helicopters and sailing yachts, appearing on television and making deals that move markets. While upstairs or in some hospital room, your older brother is lying motionless, breathing but not living. Elizabeth later said that Ghislaine, the baby born just before Michael's accident, showed signs of anorexia as a young child. At 3 years old, Ghislaine was finally forced to declare to her mother, "Mummy, I exist." Think about that for a moment. A toddler having to announce her own existence because the grief and chaos were so consuming that she'd become invisible in her own home. Robert Maxwell dealt with loss by becoming more, by expanding, by dominating every space he entered. He moved the family into Headington Hill Hall in Oxford, a sprawling mansion he rented from the city council for £2,400 a year. He called it the best council house in the country, which was his idea of a joke. But it wasn't really a home, it was headquarters. The helicopter that shuttled him around Oxford became a familiar sound overhead, a symbol of his success and his refusal to be bound by ordinary constraints like traffic or time. The yacht, eventually named Lady Ghislaine after his youngest daughter, became a floating office where business was conducted and power was displayed. His children weren't just his children. They were assets, extensions of the empire he was building. 5 of them, Christine, Isabel, Ian, Kevin, and Ghislaine, would eventually work in his companies. They didn't really have a choice. Working for their father wasn't presented as an option, but as an expectation, a duty, the price you paid for being a Maxwell. Philip, The brilliant scientist who won a scholarship to Balliol College at 16 tried to escape. He married an Argentinian woman named Nilda, moved away, tried to build his own life separate from the family business and the overwhelming presence of his father. Robert never forgave him for it. Philip was mocked, ridiculed in front of visitors, written off as a disappointment. Years later, he would end up separated from his wife, reportedly living in a bedsit in North London, another casualty of trying to be his own person in a family where loyalty meant submission and independence was treated as betrayal. But even those who stayed, who submitted to their father's will and worked in his companies, weren't safe from his cruelty. The empire's fatal cracks. Ian was taunted mercilessly growing up, ridiculed by Robert in front of visiting friends, compared unfavorably to his younger brother Kevin. The humiliation was constant, deliberate, a way of keeping him uncertain and dependent. But he stayed. Kevin, meanwhile, was the clever one, the driving force behind many of the business operations. He admitted to being completely in awe of his father, missing his presence and ability to dominate. These weren't healthy relationships built on love and mutual respect. They were dependencies, the kind that would make what came next even more tragic. Throughout the 1980s, Maxwell's empire expanded aggressively. He bought the British Printing Corporation, then Mirror Group newspapers, giving him control over the Daily Mirror and other major publications. Then he acquired Macmillan Publishers in New York, expanding his reach into American markets. He was in a constant battle with Rupert Murdoch, another media titan, and Maxwell desperately wanted not just to beat Murdoch, but to earn his respect, to be seen as an equal. He succeeded in neither. Murdoch would later call Maxwell nothing more than a crook and a total buffoon. That assessment, as it turned out, wasn't entirely wrong. What nobody knew, or what people suspected but couldn't prove, was that Maxwell was drowning in debt. The aggressive expansion had left him massively overextended. When the economic bubble of the 1980s burst and interest rates jumped, Maxwell did what desperate men often do. He started moving money around, shuffling funds between accounts, using loans from one company to shore up another. And then he did something worse, something that would eventually destroy whatever remained of his reputation. He started raiding the pension funds of his own employees. Think about what that means for a moment. These were people who'd worked for Maxwell's companies for years, sometimes decades. People who'd contributed part of every paycheck to their retirement funds, trusting that the money would be there when they needed it, when they were too old to work anymore. Maxwell was taking that money, hundreds of millions of pounds, and using it to keep his failing empire afloat. He was stealing from the people who'd built his fortune, betraying the most fundamental trust between an employer and the people who work for him. But in late 1991, the walls were closing in. The death that changed everything. Maxwell was supposed to attend a meeting at the Bank of England. He'd been summoned because he'd defaulted on £50 million in debt, and questions were being asked. Uncomfortable questions about where the money had gone and how he was going to pay it back. Instead of going to that meeting, he took his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine, and sailed to the Canary Islands. According to reports, he had a heated argument with his son Kevin the day before he left. Kevin wanted to leave the family business. The strain was becoming unbearable, the pressure of trying to hold together something that was clearly falling apart. On November 5th, 1991, at 4:25 in the morning, Maxwell made his last contact with the crew of the Lady Ghislaine. Half an hour earlier, he'd called to complain that he was too hot, demanding they turn off the air conditioning in his cabin. At 4:25, he called again, now complaining he was too cold. He ordered them to turn the air conditioning back off. These were the last words anyone heard him speak. This mundane complaint about temperature, this ordinary moment that would become the final detail of an extraordinary life. Later that morning, when the crew went to check on him, they discovered he was missing. His body was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean, naked except for a graze on his left shoulder. The official ruling was death by heart attack combined with accidental drowning, though 3 different pathologists couldn't agree on the exact cause of death. Some speculated he'd been urinating off the side of the yacht, which he apparently often did. Others wondered if he'd jumped, unable to face the financial disaster he knew was coming, choosing the ocean over the courtroom. And some, including his own family members, believed he'd been murdered, that someone had decided to solve a problem by ending his life. His daughter Ghislaine would later say she was certain he didn't take his own life, that someone must have ended it for him. The speculation about his death continues to this day, but what happened next is beyond dispute. The sons on trial within weeks. Investigators discovered the missing £440 million from the pension funds. Robert Maxwell, the war hero, the Member of Parliament, the media mogul who dined with presidents and prime ministers, had been the biggest thief in British criminal history. His reputation transformed overnight from business genius to fraudster, and his family was left to deal with the fallout. Kevin and Ian Maxwell, who'd been running the day-to-day operations of the business empire, suddenly found themselves at the center of a massive fraud investigation. In June 1992, Kevin was arrested and charged with fraud. The charges were clear and devastating. He and Ian had allegedly misused pension fund assets to raise loans to save the debt-ridden private Maxwell companies. Kevin alone faced charges involving £122 million. In October 1992, Kevin was declared bankrupt with debts of £400 million, which remains the biggest personal bankruptcy in UK history to this day. For 4 years, the brothers lived under this cloud. The trial began in 1995, a mammoth 130-day proceeding that cost taxpayers £12 million. The prosecution laid out the case methodically, day after day, detailing the movement of money, the questionable loans, the pension fund transfers. The defense argued that the brothers had trusted their father, that they'd been kept in the dark about the full extent of the fraud, that Robert Maxwell had operated in secrecy even from his own sons. Kevin testified about his father, explaining that Robert Maxwell did not consider himself above the law, but would stretch it as far as it would go. In January 1996, the jury acquitted them. All charges dropped, but the damage was done. Kevin would later become the only Maxwell sibling to publicly express remorse, speaking about the moral burden he would carry for the rest of his life. His wife, Pandora, told the court that Kevin's relationship with his father had been strained in the months before Robert's death, and that he desperately wanted to leave the family business. Now he was free in a legal sense, but the Maxwell name was ruined. Business opportunities dried up, limited mostly to overseas ventures where the name wasn't so notorious. The pension fund employees weren't as fortunate. While there was eventually a government rescue effort, and investment banks like Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, and Coopers and Lybrand helped replenish some of the stolen money, it wasn't enough. In general, pensioners received about half of what they were entitled to. Half. People who'd worked their entire lives, who'd planned their retirements around the promise of financial security, now faced old age with half the money they'd counted on. Some had to go back to work. Some had to sell their homes. Some never recovered financially. Elizabeth Maxwell, who'd stood by her husband through everything, who'd raised 9 children and supported his ambitions for decades, was left with nothing. She lost her pension, her property, everything. Her children supported her financially, and eventually the Duke of Westminster let her rent a townhouse at a minimal cost. She would later say that the worst years of her life were from 1981 to 1991, the final decade of her marriage. She'd been at Robert's beck and call with no recognition. Nothing was right. Nothing was good enough. What saved her, she said, was her work on the Holocaust, the research that gave her life meaning beyond being Robert Maxwell's wife. But the tragedy of the Maxwell family was far from over. The favourite daughter's dark secret. While Kevin and Ian tried to rebuild their lives, eventually launching a think tank in 2018 focused on combating terrorism, and while Christine and Isabel found success in Silicon Valley's tech boom, it was Ghislaine who would bring the Maxwell name back into the headlines in the most disturbing way possible. Ghislaine had always been special. She was Robert's favourite, born on Christmas Day, the baby of the family who arrived just before Michael's accident. When Michael lay in his coma and the family grieved, it was Ghislaine who seemed to bring light back into Robert's life. He indulged her, spoiled her, marked her out as different from the others. The yacht was named after her, an honour none of the other children received. After Robert's death in 1991, she moved to New York City and became a fixture in Manhattan's social scene. She was connected, charming, and sophisticated. She dated, moved in elite circles, and seemed to be building a separate life from the family scandal. That's how she met Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was a wealthy financier with homes in New York, New Mexico, Palm Beach, and a private island in the US Virgin Islands. He had connections to politicians, princes, and scientists. He presented himself as a philanthropist, donating to universities and research. According to later court testimony, he engaged in serious criminal activity, and Ghislaine Maxwell was involved in his operations. Court documents revealed that Maxwell would approach young girls from difficult backgrounds. She would befriend them, take them shopping and to social events, and position herself as a mentor. She presented opportunities and guidance. However, this was part of a larger scheme connected to Epstein's criminal enterprise. Virginia Roberts Giuffre provided testimony during the trial. She stated that Maxwell was involved in the case against Epstein. Giuffre explained the connection between Maxwell and Epstein. Court records showed multiple young people reported similar stories. Maxwell connected individuals to Epstein. This happened repeatedly over time. Maxwell was part of the legal case brought by federal prosecutors. She was present during the time period in question. She had knowledge of events. The legal proceedings revealed she took actions that aided Epstein. Some individuals involved were as young as 14. The pattern lasted for several years. Their conduct remained secret because of their financial resources and social position. Those in their circle did not know what occurred. Justice finally arrives. But in 2019, Epstein was finally arrested on federal charges. He was held in a New York jail, and in August of that year, he was found unresponsive in his cell. The official ruling was that he had taken his own life, though conspiracy theories immediately emerged suggesting otherwise. Either way, Epstein was gone, but Maxwell remained. In July 2020, the FBI arrested Ghislaine Maxwell in New Hampshire, where she'd been hiding in a property she'd purchased through a carefully structured company to keep her name off the records. She was charged with multiple crimes related to the enticement and trafficking of minors. She was denied bail, with the judge noting concerns about her completely opaque finances, her skill at living in hiding, and the fact that France, where she held citizenship, doesn't extradite its citizens. The trial was set for December 2021. Throughout the trial, her siblings stood by her. Isabel attended every day, sitting in the public gallery, waving gestures of support to her sister. Kevin was there for several days, speaking to reporters about the conditions she was enduring, arguing she was being inadequately fed and mistreated. Ian and Christine also appeared. They launched a website proclaiming their belief in her innocence, insisting that she was being scapegoated for Epstein's crimes. It was a strange echo of their defense of their father all those years ago, a family closing ranks even when the evidence suggested they shouldn't, even when loyalty might be misplaced. The prosecution presented testimony from victims, now women, who described what Maxwell had done to them when they were girls. They described the grooming, the manipulation, the way she'd made them trust her before betraying that trust in the worst possible way. They described their trauma, the years of therapy, the difficulty forming relationships, the way those experiences had shaped and damaged their lives. The defense argued that Maxwell was being blamed for Epstein's crimes, that she was a victim herself, manipulated by a powerful man. The jury didn't buy it. In December 2021, after a month-long trial, Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted on 5 out of 6 counts, including trafficking a minor. The verdict was read in a courtroom packed with victims and their supporters, with journalists and members of the public who'd followed the case. When the guilty verdicts were announced, some victims cried. Others sat in silence, processing what this moment meant after years of waiting for justice. In June 2022, Ghislaine Maxwell was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, the legacy of a fallen dynasty. The US attorney called it a sentence that held her accountable for perpetrating heinous crimes against children, noting that no one is above the law and that it's never too late for justice. For the victims who testified, women now who'd been girls when Maxwell groomed them, it was a measure of closure. But closure doesn't undo trauma, doesn't give back the years stolen or the innocence taken. It doesn't erase the nightmares, or fix the broken trust, or heal the wounds that never quite close. And so, the Maxwell dynasty ended, not with a simple fall, but with a catastrophic implosion that spanned generations and continents. It started with a man who survived the Holocaust and reinvented himself, who built an empire but could never stop needing more, who stole from his own employees to maintain an illusion of success. It continued with children who grew up in luxury, but paid for it with their emotional well-being, who either submitted to their father's will or were exiled from the family. And it ended with a daughter who had every advantage, every opportunity, who could have done anything with her life, but chose instead to help a predator harm children. There are patterns here that feel almost Shakespearean in their tragedy. The patriarch who demands total loyalty and crushes anyone who seeks independence. The children who know something is wrong, but can't escape the gravity of the family name. The money that seems limitless, but is actually built on theft. The yacht named for a favorite daughter who would one day sit in a federal prison. The Holocaust survivor whose own moral compass was so broken that he could justify stealing from working people. The war hero whose courage on the battlefield didn't translate into decency in business or kindness in family life. But unlike Shakespeare, these aren't characters in a play, they're real people. The Mirror Group employees who lost their pensions were real, facing real financial hardship in their retirement years. The young girls whom Ghislaine Maxwell groomed and delivered to Epstein were real, carrying real trauma into their adult lives. The family members who lived through Michael's coma and Kareen's death, and Robert's drowning, and the pension scandal, and Ghislaine's conviction, they're real too, living with a legacy that's been poisoned beyond repair. Kevin Maxwell once said that his father would stretch the law as far as it would go. That turned out to be an understatement. Robert Maxwell didn't just bend rules, he broke them catastrophically, stealing hundreds of millions and leaving ordinary people to pay the price. And his daughter didn't just stretch moral boundaries, she crossed them in ways that destroyed young lives. The question that haunts the Maxwell story is whether these outcomes were inevitable, whether something in the family's DNA made this trajectory unavoidable, or whether different choices at key moments could have changed everything. The Maxwell story reminds us that dynasties aren't just about wealth and power. They're about what gets passed down through generations, the lessons absorbed at the dinner table, the patterns repeated without examination. Robert Maxwell taught his children that what mattered was winning, dominating, never showing weakness. He taught them that other people were either useful or irrelevant. He taught them that family loyalty meant protecting the name above everything else, even truth, even justice. Some of his children rejected those lessons and paid for it with exile and mockery. Others internalized them and paid a different price, one measured in court verdicts and prison sentences. Today, the Maxwell name carries weight, but not the kind Robert would have wanted. It's not associated with media empires or political influence or business acumen. It's associated with pension fraud and trafficking, with lives ruined and trust betrayed on a massive scale. Headington Hill Hall, where the family once lived in splendor, entertaining politicians and celebrities, went to the receivers after Robert's death. The mansion that had hosted grand parties and important meetings, where deals were struck and power was displayed, stood empty for a time before being repurposed. Elizabeth eventually sold everything that remained and returned to France, where she lived until her death in 2013, spending her final years far from the wreckage of the life she'd built with Robert. The yacht was sold, renamed, stripped of the Maxwell identity. The empire collapsed piece by piece. The money disappeared into the hands of creditors and lawyers. The power evaporated like morning fog burned away by the rising sun. What remains is a cautionary tale about ambition without ethics, about family loyalty taken to a toxic extreme, about how the drive to build something great can become the justification for doing terrible things. The Maxwell children who survived and stayed out of prison are still trying to live their lives. Some quietly, some still defending the family name with a determination that seems almost desperate. Christine and Isabel carved out careers in technology, working in Silicon Valley during its boom years, building something separate from the family legacy. But the name they're defending isn't the one Robert built through decades of business deals and media acquisitions. It's the one he destroyed through theft and deception. They're trying to reclaim something that might have never really existed, a version of their father and their family that was noble and worthy, that deserved the respect it once commanded. In the end, the Maxwell dynasty fell apart, not because of external enemies or bad luck or changing times. It fell apart because of choices, deliberate decisions to value power over people, success over integrity, the family image over the truth. Robert Maxwell chose to steal from his employees rather than admit failure and downsize his empire. He could have scaled back, could have sold off parts of the business, could have faced his creditors honestly. But that would have meant admitting weakness, showing vulnerability, accepting that he wasn't invincible. So instead, he reached into the pension funds, taking money that wasn't his, betraying people who'd given him years of their working lives. Ghislaine Maxwell chose to help Jeffrey Epstein harm children, rather than walk away from that relationship and build a different life. She had options, had resources, had the education and connections to do anything she wanted. But she chose complicity, chose to participate in exploitation, chose her own comfort over the safety of vulnerable young girls. These weren't mistakes or accidents or momentary lapses in judgment. They were choices, sustained patterns of behavior repeated over years, and choices have consequences that echo long after the moment passes. The consequences rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water, touching everyone connected to the family in ways both visible and hidden. Pensioners who'd trusted their employer faced retirement with half their expected income, forced to make impossible choices between medication and food, between heating their homes and paying their bills. Some returned to work in their 70s, bodies worn out, but bank accounts empty. Young women carried trauma from their teenage years into adulthood, into their own relationships and families, struggling to trust, struggling to feel safe, struggling to believe they deserved better than what had been done to them. Family members lived with the knowledge of what their father and sister had done, trying to reconcile the people they'd known, the moments of tenderness or humor or connection, with the crimes they'd committed. Every family dinner, every birthday, every memory was now tainted, viewed through the lens of what came after. And the Maxwell name, which Robert had worked so hard to establish and elevate, which he'd built from nothing through ambition and will and ruthless determination, became a synonym for scandal and corruption, spoken with disgust instead of respect. There's no redemption arc here, no moment where someone steps forward to make things right, to undo the damage or compensate the victims. Kevin's expression of moral burden is the closest thing to an apology the victims ever received from the Maxwell family, and even that came wrapped in legal language and careful phrasing, acknowledging pain without fully accepting responsibility. The pension funds were partially, but not fully, replenished through government intervention and legal settlements, a bureaucratic solution that couldn't fully heal the financial wounds or restore what had been stolen. Ghislaine's victims testified and saw her convicted, watched her led away in handcuffs, heard the judge pronounce a sentence of 20 years. But that doesn't undo what happened to them, doesn't erase the years of trauma, or give them back their innocence or their teenage years. It doesn't fix the relationships that fell apart because they couldn't trust anyone. It doesn't quiet the nightmares that still wake them decades later. The dynasty that Robert Maxwell built didn't just collapse, it poisoned the ground where it stood, making it impossible for anything healthy to grow there again, contaminating everything it touched with the corruption at its core. What the Maxwell story ultimately shows us is how much damage one family can do when power becomes the only value that matters, when winning becomes more important than how you win, when maintaining the image becomes more important than being worthy of that image. Robert Maxwell escaped the Holocaust, served his country with bravery, and built a significant publishing empire. Those are real achievements that shouldn't be dismissed or erased from history. But they weren't enough for him. He needed more, always more. And when he couldn't get it legitimately through business deals and market competition, he stole it from people who'd trusted him, from employees who'd believed their futures were secure. The war hero who'd risked his life for freedom became the thief who stole security from working people. The self-made man who'd built an empire from nothing couldn't accept the possibility of losing it, so he destroyed it himself rather than let it shrink naturally. Ghislaine Maxwell grew up with every advantage imaginable, educated at Oxford, connected to the wealthy and powerful around the world, free to build whatever life she wanted. She spoke multiple languages, moved in elite circles, had opportunities most people never dream of. But she chose to use those advantages to help exploit vulnerable children. That choice, repeated over years, destroying one young life after another, destroyed lives and eventually destroyed her own freedom. The advantages didn't corrupt her. The choices did. Decisions made again and again to prioritize her own comfort and status over the well-being of young girls who should have been protected. She could have walked away at any time, could have called the police, could have used her connections to help instead of harm. But she didn't. And that's what makes her crimes so incomprehensible to many people. She had no excuse, no desperate circumstances, no lack of options. She simply chose cruelty, and exploitation. The saddest part might be the children who didn't choose this path, who were just born into a family that would become infamous. Philip, who tried to escape and paid for it with ridicule and estrangement, who wanted nothing more than to be a scientist and live his own life away from the empire. Anne, who pursued acting and then disappeared from public life, avoiding the spotlight that destroyed so many others, choosing obscurity over the constant glare of judgment. Michael and Karine, who died young and never had to see what their family would become, never had to carry the weight of that legacy or answer questions about their father's crimes or their sister's conviction. In some ways, their early deaths were mercies, though that's a terrible thing to think about any child. Even Ian and Kevin, who were acquitted but spent years under suspicion, their names forever linked to their father's crimes, even though they were cleared of wrongdoing. They testified, they defended themselves, they were found innocent, but the stain never fully washed away. They all carried the weight of the Maxwell name, whether they wanted to or not, whether they deserved to or not, whether they'd done anything wrong themselves, or simply had the misfortune of being born into the wrong family. Dynasties rise on ambition and fall on corruption, but they also fall on something simpler: the belief that the rules don't apply to you, that your family name puts you above ordinary morality, that loyalty to family trumps loyalty to truth and justice. The Maxwells believed all of that, and it destroyed them from the inside out. What looked like an empire was actually a fraud built on stolen money, a house of cards that could only stand as long as no one looked too closely at the foundation. What looked like a family was actually a collection of people trapped in roles they couldn't escape, damaged by a patriarch who saw them as extensions of himself rather than as individuals with their own needs and dreams. And what looked like success was actually a slow-motion catastrophe that took decades to fully reveal itself, peeling back layer after layer to expose the rot underneath the polish. The Maxwell story is over now, at least in terms of new chapters being written. Robert is dead, found floating in the Atlantic under mysterious circumstances that will never be fully explained. Elizabeth is gone, having lived her final years trying to rebuild some kind of dignity separate from her husband's crimes, reconnecting with her work on the Holocaust, the one thing that gave her life meaning beyond being Mrs. Robert Maxwell. Ghislaine is in prison, facing decades behind bars for her role in harming children, her name now synonymous with the worst kind of betrayal. The other siblings are scattered across the globe, some trying to rebuild careers in technology and business, others living quietly away from public scrutiny, all carrying a name that means something very different now than it did when their father first built his empire. The helicopters are gone, the yachts are sold, the mansion is repurposed. The newspapers belong to other owners. What we're left with is a story that seems almost too dark to be true, too tragic to have happened to one family. But it did happen. It is true. And the victims are still living with the consequences every single day. The employees who lost their pensions are still dealing with the financial impact decades later, living in smaller homes than they'd planned, cutting back on medications, unable to help their grandchildren with college the way they'd hoped. The women who were groomed and abused as teenagers are still processing the trauma, still in therapy, still working to build healthy relationships and trust other people. The Maxwell children who weren't involved in the crimes are still living under the shadow of a name they can never fully escape, introducing themselves and watching people's faces change when they make the connection, seeing the questions form even when they're not spoken aloud. This is what happens when a family's story becomes defined by the worst things its members have done. When the name that was supposed to represent achievement and success instead represents betrayal and harm. The Maxwell dynasty didn't just end, it imploded. taking decades to fully collapse and leaving destruction in its wake. And now, when people hear that name, they don't think of publishing empires or political connections or business acumen. They think of pension fraud and trafficking, of lives destroyed and trust betrayed. That's the Maxwell legacy now, and no amount of rehabilitation or rewriting can change it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.